The boy was 11 years old, standing barefoot on a Chicago sidewalk in February, and he was singing. Not loudly, not for money, not for attention. He was singing the way people sing when they think no one is listening. Half under his breath, eyes cast down at the cracked concrete, fingers wrapped around a paper coffee cup someone had left on a bench. The song was old, soft, something about a river and a lantern and coming home before dark. Across the street, inside the warm lobby of Caldwell and Pierce Architecture, 53-year-old Stuart Aldridge was buttoning his coat and telling his assistant he'd be back by 3. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and the kind of face that had once been open and now wasn't. His wife, Meredith, had died 4 years ago. His company had survived. His son, Fletcher, was 14 and did not speak to him much anymore. Stuart stepped through the revolving door and the cold hit him like a wall. That's when he heard it. He stopped walking. People moved around him on the sidewalk, annoyed, but he stood still because something in that melody had reached into his chest and grabbed hold of something he hadn't touched in a long time. He turned. He saw the boy, small, dark-haired, wearing a coat 2 sizes too big and shoes with a hole above the left toe. The boy didn't notice him. He was still singing, swaying slightly, eyes almost closed. Stuart stood there for a full 30 seconds before he realized his throat was tight. Because the song, that particular song, with that particular phrasing, was the one Meredith used to hum while she made coffee on Sunday mornings. She'd never told him where she learned it. She'd just always known it. And now this child, this barefoot child on a February sidewalk in Chicago, was singing it like he'd been born knowing it too. His assistant called his name from the doorway. He didn't answer. The boy opened his eyes and saw the man staring at him and immediately went still, the way children do when they've learned that being noticed by adults is not always a good thing. "Hey," Stuart said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "That song. Where did you learn it?" The boy looked at him for a long moment. "My mom," he said, then quieter. "She used to sing it. Used to." Stuart understood those 2 words in a way he wished he didn't. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated. "Jonah, Jonah." Stuart glanced at the boy's feet, the hole above the left toe, the cold. "Are you hungry?" What Stuart did not know, could not have known, standing on that sidewalk, was that Jonah Pruitt had been sleeping in the back room of a laundromat on Archer Avenue for 11 days. The owner, a 60-year-old Haitian woman named Mrs. Celestine, who everyone called Tante, had found him curled up behind the industrial dryers one night and had not had the heart to send him away. She fed him soup and let him sleep and asked very few questions, because she had learned in her 70 years that children who end up in laundromats at midnight have already been asked too many questions by the wrong people. Jonah's mother, Laurel Pruitt, had been admitted to Cook County Hospital 8 weeks earlier with pneumonia that turned into sepsis. She was still there. She had not been able to tell anyone what to do with Jonah, because for the first 3 weeks she hadn't been conscious, and by the time she was afraid of what would happen if she did. She'd been afraid for years, really. Not of Jonah's father. He was long gone, and she had no feelings about him one way or another. She was afraid of a man named Garrett Pierce, but Jonah didn't know about Garrett Pierce. He was 11, and what he knew was that his mother was sick, that the hospital let him visit on Tuesdays and Thursdays if Tanti drove him, and that the song she'd taught him made him feel like she was standing right behind him, even when she wasn't. He didn't know that the song had another history entirely. He didn't know that his mother had learned it from a woman she'd known 12 years ago, in a different city, in a different life. A woman who had sung it to her own child, and then had that child taken from her by a man who believed that love was something you could manage, contain, redirect, like water through a pipe. He just knew it made the cold feel a little less cold. So when the tall man with the gray temples asked him where he'd learned it, Jonah told the truth, because lying took energy he didn't have, and because something about the man's face, the way it had gone very still, very quietly broken, made Jonah think that maybe the truth was the right answer this time. Stuart took Jonah to the diner on the corner. He ordered him scrambled eggs and toast and orange juice, and watched the boy eat with the focused, grateful efficiency of someone who had been rationing meals. He didn't ask too many questions. He'd been a father long enough to know that pushing made walls go up, and whatever walls this child had built were there for good reason. He asked about the song instead. Jonah said his mother called it the River Light. He said she used to sing it every night before bed, and sometimes when she was cooking, and once, and here the boy paused, picked at his toast, when she was crying and didn't know he was watching. Stuart looked out the diner window at the gray Chicago sky. Meredith had called it the same thing, the River Light. He'd asked her once where it came from, and she'd said she didn't remember, that it felt like she'd always known it, like something that had been put inside her before she was old enough to ask questions. He pressed his palms flat on the table and asked, very carefully, where Jonah's mother was. Jonah told him about the hospital, about Tante, about the laundromat on Archer Avenue. Stuart called his assistant and cancelled the 3 o'clock. What happened next would take months to fully understand, and even then, some pieces would never quite fit the way people wanted them to. But here is what was true. Stuart went to Cook County Hospital the following Tuesday with Jonah. He sat in the waiting room while the boy went in to see his mother. After 40 minutes, a nurse came out and told Stuart that Laurel Pruitt had asked if he would come in. He'd expected someone defeated, someone small. What he found was a woman in her early 30s who had clearly been beautiful and was still, despite everything, precise. The word that came to him later. Precise in the way she spoke. Precise in the way she looked at him, like she was measuring something. Jonah told me about the song, she said. Her voice was thin but steady. He told me you recognized it. My wife used to sing it, Stuart said. She passed 4 years ago. Laurel looked at him for a long time. What was her name? Meredith Aldridge. Meredith Park before we married. Something moved across Laurel's face that Stuart couldn't read. She turned toward the window. Outside, a pigeon was sitting on the ledge very still, as if it was also listening. I learned that song from a woman named Meredith, Laurel said. 12 years ago. In Seattle. She paused. She was in a bad situation. We were both in a bad situation, different ways. She was kind to me. She used to sing to my baby when I couldn't, when I was working nights, and she'd watch him for me. She sang it like breathing, like it was just what you did when a child needed comfort. Stuart's hands had gone very still. She had a son, Laurel continued. She'd had him with a man she was trying to leave. The man's family had money and power, and they'd made her life very difficult. The last time I saw her, she told me she was going to take the baby and go somewhere they couldn't find her. Laurel stopped. I never heard from her again. What was her son's name? Laurel turned back from the window. Her eyes were very clear, very tired. She called him Kit, she said, but his full name was Christopher. Christopher Aldridge. She'd kept the name even though she was leaving his father, because she said the name wasn't his father's fault. The room was very quiet. Stuart heard his own pulse. Christopher Aldridge was his son's name. Fletcher's full name, the name on his birth certificate, the name Meredith had chosen before he was born, was Christopher Fletcher Aldridge. They'd called him Fletcher from the beginning because Meredith said Christopher was too big a name for a baby, and the nickname had stuck, and he'd always assumed it was just that, a preference, a quirk. He had never known about a first Christopher. He had never known about Seattle. He had never known, God, he had never known that his wife had had a child before him. The drive back to his office was the longest of Stuart's life. He sat in the back of the car and did not look at his phone. He thought about the 14 years of his marriage, the way Meredith cried sometimes without explanation and then deflected when he asked, the way she flinched once at a particular last name at a party, and he'd assumed it was just social anxiety, the way she held Fletcher, both of her hands, always both, like she was afraid of losing him. He had a son, Fletcher, 14, sullen, fond of basketball and old movies, and pretending he didn't care about things he cared enormously about. And somewhere, or nowhere, there might have been another child, a boy named Christopher, briefly, before he was renamed or disappeared or was taken somewhere Meredith couldn't follow, or he was still somewhere, 11 years old, barefoot on a sidewalk in February, singing a song his mother had taught him, a mother who was not Meredith but who had known Meredith, had loved Meredith enough to carry her songs forward. Stuart made himself breathe. He needed to think. He needed to be very careful. And he needed to make some calls. The man's name was Garrett Pierce, and he was 58 years old, and he was the other half of Caldwell and Pierce, the firm whose lobby Stuart had walked out of on the morning. Everything changed. Stuart had known Garrett for 22 years. He had always found him slightly cold, slightly too polished, the kind of man who was charming in exactly the right amounts, in exactly the right rooms. He'd never had cause to think much beyond that. Now he thought about it a great deal. He hired a private investigator named Roland, who was 64 and retired from the CPD and said very little, but listened extremely well. Stewart told him about Meredith, about Seattle, about the name Christopher, and about Garrett Pierce. He told him about Jonah and Laurel. He asked Roland to be careful and quiet and thorough. Roland called back 11 days later. Garrett Pierce had 23 years ago been briefly involved with a woman named Meredith Park in Seattle. The relationship had ended badly. More specifically, it had ended with Meredith attempting to leave quietly with a 4-month-old child, and Garrett's family's lawyers filing for emergency custody on grounds of instability. The case had proceeded through a judge in Pierce's family's pocket. Meredith had lost. The child, a boy born in a county hospital, listed as Christopher P. Pierce, had been placed in a closed adoption within 6 months. Stewart read the report 3 times. Then he called Laurel at the hospital and said, very quietly, that he thought he understood now. He asked if she had any documents from her time in Seattle, any photographs, anything Meredith might have left with her. There was a long pause, then Laurel said, "She left me a box when she disappeared. I kept it because I didn't know what else to do, and I moved it with me every time I moved because it felt wrong to throw away something that belonged to someone who'd been kind to me." Another pause. "It's in a storage unit on Pulaski. Jonah has the key." The box was cardboard, the corners soft with age. Inside, a small photograph of a baby, 3 or 4 months old, wrapped in a yellow blanket, with Meredith's unmistakable dark eyes. A letter, handwritten, never sent, addressed only to C, which could have meant Christopher, or could have meant the name she intended to give him, which she'd written in the margin as Callum, before crossing it out. A thin blue hair ribbon, knotted in a particular way that Stewart recognized immediately as the way Meredith knotted everything. Her shoelaces, her scarves, tight and precise, and with a little loop at the end. And a second photograph, this one of Meredith with a woman Stewart didn't recognize, both of them young, both of them laughing, standing in front of a chain-link fence with sunlight in their hair. He turned the second photograph over. On the back, in Meredith's handwriting, "Laurel and me, Green Lake, 2001. She doesn't know yet, neither do I, but we will." Stewart sat in the storage unit on a folding chair Jonah had dragged out from somewhere, and he cried quietly for about 10 minutes, while the boy sat nearby and said nothing and didn't look away, which was, Stewart thought later, exactly the right thing to do. Christopher Pierce, the child listed in the adoption record, had been placed with a family in Minneapolis. Roland found the records. The adoptive family, a couple named Braddock, had moved to Detroit when the child was 6. The father had died when the child was 9. The mother had remarried. The child, who went by Marcus Braddock for a year, and then, when the stepfather turned out to be neither kind nor reliable, had started going by a name he'd made up for himself, had aged out of a series of difficult situations and ended up, at 11 years old, in Chicago. His name, the one he'd chosen himself, was Jonah. He had no memory of being called Christopher. He had no memory of Meredith. He had been 4 months old when she lost him, and 4 months is not long enough to form a face or a voice or a name. But something had been put inside him before he was old enough to ask questions. A woman's voice, warm and quiet and precise, singing about a river and a lantern and coming home before dark. He had carried it all his life without knowing what it was. Stewart sat across from the boy in Tante's back room, 3 weeks after the storage unit, and told him everything. He did not simplify it, he did not soften the edges. He thought Jonah deserved the full weight of the truth, the beauty of it, and the cruelty of it both, and he was right. The boy listened without interrupting. When Stewart finished, the room was quiet except for the tumble of one of the machines in the front. Jonah sat with it for a while, then he said, "So she was my mom, the one who sang it first." "Yes," Stewart said, "and she wanted to keep me, more than anything." Jonah looked down at his hands. He had Meredith's fingers, Stewart realized. Long, careful, precise. "Okay," the boy said. "Then can I see Fletcher?" Fletcher Aldridge did not handle things the way people expected teenagers to handle things. He did not yell. He did not storm off. He sat at the kitchen table where his father had laid out the documents and the photographs in the report, and he went through them slowly, page by page, picture by picture, in silence. When he was done, he put everything in a neat pile and straightened the edges and said, "She never told you." "No. Did she know you wouldn't be mad?" Stuart thought about that. I don't know what she was afraid of, he said honestly. I've been thinking about it for weeks. I think she was afraid of a lot of things by the time she found me. I think she'd learned that people leave or get taken, and so she protected things she loved by keeping them separate. He paused. I don't think she was right to do that, but I understand why. Fletcher nodded slowly. He looked at the photograph of the baby in the yellow blanket. He looked at it for a long time. He likes basketball, he finally said. Stuart blinked. I actually don't know. I haven't asked. Fletcher set the photograph down with the same care he'd given everything else. We should probably find that out. What came next was not simple, and anyone who tells you it was is leaving out the hard parts. There were lawyers. There were records that had to be unsealed, and records that had to be filed, and records that had to be corrected. Roland testified to what he'd found. Laurel, recovering slowly, gave a deposition from her hospital bed with a clarity that surprised everyone in the room, including her own attorney. The judge who had handled the original custody proceeding was long retired, but two of Garrett Pierce's family members, a cousin and a former business partner, agreed to speak, quietly and off the record at first, and then publicly. Once it became clear which way the wind was blowing. Garrett Pierce resigned from Caldwell & Pierce in March. The firm was renamed. The civil case moved forward slowly, as civil cases do, and the outcome would not be certain for a long time yet, but it moved. Jonah stayed with Tante through the winter while the legal process worked itself out. He visited the Aldridge house on Sundays, and then on Thursdays too, and then on some Wednesdays. He and Fletcher did not become brothers the way it happens in movies, in a rush, in a revelation, in a single afternoon of tears. They became brothers the way most things that last become what they are. Slowly, without announcement, through repetition and small gestures and the gradual lowering of 1,000 tiny guards, Fletcher taught Jonah to play chess badly. Jonah taught Fletcher that sometimes you could just sit with another person and not say anything, and it would be fine, actually. Stuart watched them from across the room sometimes and felt something he did not have an exact word for, not happiness, exactly, which felt too simple. Something more like the feeling of a door opening in a wall you'd forgotten was there. Laurel recovered. It took longer than anyone hoped and less time than anyone feared. She was discharged in April, thinner than before, careful on stairs. Tante threw her a party in the laundromat on Archer Avenue, with paper decorations and rice and beans, and a cake that was slightly lopsided on one side. Jonah stood next to her for most of the party with his shoulder touching hers, which was how he showed people he loved them. In May, Laurel was offered a job at a nonprofit that worked with families navigating the foster system. She said yes before they finished explaining what the salary would be. In June, on a warm evening when the Chicago sky did that thing it sometimes does in summer where it goes completely, impossibly orange, Stuart sat on his back porch and heard, through the open window, the sound of Jonah singing, just softly, just under his breath the way he always did. Something about a river and a lantern. And then after a moment, Fletcher's voice joining in, halting, slightly off-key, following the melody like someone learning by feel. Stuart did not move. He sat very still and let it wash over him, the two voices finding each other, phrase by phrase, measure by measure. Jonah knew all the words. Fletcher didn't know any of them yet, but he kept trying, kept following, and Jonah slowed down without being asked. Let the phrases land more gently so Fletcher had time to catch them. Meredith had put that song into the world twice, once into her firstborn son, who did not know where it came from, and once into every quiet morning of a life she'd built from scratch. And here it was now, still moving, still finding its way forward, still doing what she'd always meant it to do. Stuart put his face in his hands, not from grief but from something that had been waiting a long time to be released. Inside, the boys kept singing.